I had ridden Quillback Road for 31 years, and I had never once stopped on it. Until the summer the wells went bad, and I found 3 dying donkeys in the white dust where everybody else had decided not to look. You have to understand what that road was by then. The drought had been on us 2 years, and that second August it turned mean. The Mahonia Wash, that I had watered cattle in since I was a boy, was a cracked gray scar you could have driven a wagon down the middle of. The grass on the Caldwell Flats had gone the color of old bone. The sky every morning came up hard and bright and empty, and a man learned to hate a clear sky the way he'd once loved it. I was old by then. I'll say it plain because the rest of this won't make sense if I don't. I was 66 years old that summer, a widower 9 years, and I had spent those 9 years getting very good at needing nobody. My wife, Adeline, was buried up on the rise behind the house under a juniper that I kept alive with wash water when I'd let everything else on the place go brown. I rode my line, I doctored my few remaining cattle, I came home to a cold stove, and I had told myself a long time ago that this was a sufficient way to finish out. A man can convince himself of almost anything if he says it to an empty kitchen long enough. So I was no soft touch. I want that understood. When I came around the bend below Sundermere that morning, leading my pack mule and bringing a bag of mail and flour back to the ranch, and I saw the gray shapes down in the ditch by the dry wash, my first thought was not mercy. My first thought was, somebody's stock has died and left a mess in the heat. Then one of the shapes moved. I drew up. It was a Jenny, a gray she-donkey, ribs standing out under a coat gone dull as ash, and she was lying on her side in the bottom of the ditch with her neck stretched out flat. Beside her were 2 foals. One was maybe 4 months old and down like its mother, its little sides going in and out too fast. The other was younger, a knock-kneed thing, and it was the only one still on its feet, and it was standing over the Jenny with its head hung low, swaying, refusing to lie down. There was a 4th animal a little ways off in the brush, an older one, and that one was already gone. The flies had found it. I sat my horse and I looked at them, and I did the arithmetic a frontier man does. They were nobodies that I knew. They were a long way from any place that would feed them. They were 3/4 dead, and the kindest and the most sensible thing, the thing that wouldn't cost me anything I couldn't spare, was to ride on to Sundermere and let nature finish what the drought had started. That's not cruelty. Out there in a dry year, that was just sense, and I had ridden past worse and harder things than donkeys and slept fine. And I would have ridden on. I want you to know that I sat there a full minute with every intention of riding on. But while I sat there, 2 wagons came up the road behind me and went by. The first was Royce Embry's freight wagon, and Embry himself on the box. He was a square, ruddy man who held paper on half the small places between Sundermere and the river, a man who'd done well out of the drought, the way a certain kind of man always does, buying up debt at a nickel and calling it in at $1. He slowed his team just enough to take in the donkeys and me sitting over them. He grinned at me out of that red face. "Cobb," he said, "you fixing to start a glue works?" "Just looking," I said. "Looking won't water 'em." He clucked to his team and pulled wide around the ditch so his wheels wouldn't have to bump the dead one, and he went on toward town, and the dust of him drifted down over the Jenny, and she didn't so much as flick an ear. She was that far gone. The second wagon was the Reverend Thad Price and his wife, coming back from a burying out at the flats. They were good church people. I'd known them 20 years. The Reverend looked down at the animals as he passed, and I saw his face do that thing a soft man's face does when it wants to feel something and would rather not, and his wife put her handkerchief up to her nose against the smell of the dead one, and the Reverend said, gentle as you please, "The Lord's mercy on all his creatures, Asa," and then he drove on by too. Drove right on by, with the Lord's mercy on his lips. And I'll tell you, it was that not the donkeys but the driving by that got into me. I have thought on it many times since. If those 2 wagons hadn't come along, I believe I'd have ridden to town and never looked back and never known what I missed. but I watched two men ride around a dying thing and tell themselves it was sense or it was providence, and something in me, some old contrary stubborn thing that Adeline used to laugh at and love, set its heels. I got down off my horse. I had one canteen, and it was maybe two-thirds full, and it was every drop of water between me and the ranch, which was 11 miles on. I am not going to pretend I didn't think about that. A man can die of foolishness on a dry road as easy as a donkey can. But I climbed down into that ditch, and I knelt by the Jenny's head in the dust, and I poured a little water into my cupped hand and held it under her nose. She didn't move at first. Then her lip twitched. Then her tongue came out, gray and dry as a strap of old leather, and she touched the water in my hand, and she drank not a swallow, just a touch, just enough to find out it was real, and she opened one eye and looked at me. I've been looked at by a lot of things in a long life. By men over the barrel of a gun, by my wife on the last morning, by my own face in the shaving glass on mornings I didn't much want to. I will tell you that the look that old gray Jenny gave me out of the bottom of that ditch, when she found out somebody had finally stopped, I felt it go all the way down. She wasn't begging. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She'd quit begging long before I got there. She just looked at me like she was making certain of me, like she was deciding whether to spend the last of herself believing it. "All right," I said to her out loud like a fool alone on an empty road. "All right, I've got you." I gave her more. I gave the down foal more. I had to dribble it slow, because a starved thing will founder on too much water as fast as too little, and I'd seen that in calves. The standing foal, the little knock-kneed one, wouldn't come to me, just stood swaying over its mother. But when I held my wet hand up to it, it finally lowered its head and drank from my fingers, and its whole little body shook while it did. By the time my canteen was empty, I had 3 donkeys looking at me instead of 3 donkeys dying, and I had no water left, and 11 miles to go. And the smartest man in the county would have told me I'd just thrown away the only thing that might keep me alive on a fool's errand for stock that probably die anyhow. I want to be honest about the next part, because it's where the story turns and I don't want to dress it up. I could not get them up. The Jenny tried. She got her front legs under her twice and went down both times, and the down foal couldn't try at all. I am 66 years old, and I could not lift a grown donkey out of a ditch by myself, and I was not going to leave them now that I'd watered them, because watering a thing and then leaving it is worse than passing it by. Passing by at least is honest. So I did the only thing there was. I took the little knock-kneed foal, the one on its feet, the lightest of them, maybe 60 pounds of bone and dust, and I got it up across the front of my saddle, the way you'd carry an orphaned calf, and I lashed it gentle so it couldn't fall, and I left the Jenny and the down foal in the ditch in what shade the brush threw, and I rode for the nearest water I knew of, which was the seep at the old Doan place, 4 miles off the road. I didn't know it was the Doan place that mattered yet. I didn't know anything yet. I just knew there was a seep there that sometimes still ran in the rocks when everything else was dry, because I'd watered horses there 40 years before when old Doan was alive and the world was younger. The seep was running, barely, a thread of water off a mossy ledge into a stone basin no bigger than a hat, but running. I filled my canteen and my hat and everything that would hold water, and I rode back to the ditch as fast as the foal across my saddle would let me. And the Jenny was still alive, and the down foal was still alive, and I watered them again, and I sat in the dirt with them through the worst heat of the day, fanning the flies off and talking to them low the way you talk to anything that's scared and hurting. Which is to say, I told that Jenny a great deal of nonsense about my own life that I had never told a living soul. Because the dead don't repeat what you tell them, and I'd figure the donkeys for as good as dead. Along about evening, when the heat broke, the Jenny got up. She did it on her own. I didn't lift her. She gathered herself and she heaved up onto all 4 legs and stood there trembling like a new thing, and then she put her nose down and pushed at the down foal until it answered her, and between the two of us, me hauling on a loop of rope under its belly and her nudging, We got the down foal standing too. And then I had 3 donkeys on their feet on Quillback Road at dusk, and 11 miles still to go, and not a soul who'd have believed it if I'd told them. We walked it, all night. The donkeys could only go a little ways and rest, a little ways and rest, and I led my horse and carried the youngest foal again when it played out, and we came up the lane to my ranch as the sky was going gray in the east, 4 of us, me and a horse and a mule and 3 donkeys, the strangest outfit that ever crossed the Caldwell Flats. I put them in the old foaling shed by the barn, where there was shade and a trough I could keep filled from the house cistern, low as it was. I rubbed the jenny down. I made a gruel of meal and what little molasses I had and fed it to them in handfuls. And then I went up to the house and I sat down at my kitchen table, 66 years old and hadn't slept in a day and a night, and I put my head down on my arms, and for the first time since I'd buried Adeline, I felt like there was a reason to have come home. I told myself it was foolishness. I told myself I'd be lucky to keep the youngest one alive, and that I'd done a sentimental old man's thing that would cost me water and meal I couldn't spare, and that nobody would ever know or care. I was wrong about every part of that, but it took the rest of the summer and the whole of what came after to find out how wrong. They lived. That was the first surprise, and it was a near thing. The down foal, I came to call him Brick, for the color he turned out to be once the dust washed off him. A good red-brown Brick foundered twice in that first week, and once I sat up the whole night with him sure I'd lose him by morning, and once I had to walk him in slow circles around the foaling shed by lantern light for 3 hours to keep his gut from twisting. But he came through. The little knock-kneed one was a Jenny foal, and she had more grit in her than anything I'd ever doctored. I called her Sparrow because she was small and brown and would not be still. And the old gray Jenny herself, the mother, she came back slow and steady, and within 2 weeks she had filled out enough that the ribs didn't show, and she'd follow me around the yard like a dog, and put her gray head against my chest and lean there heavy, the way they do when they've decided you belong to them. I found the mark of who they'd been the second day. I was currying the gray Jenny, getting the matted dust out of her mane and braided up in the hair at her withers, faded and filthy but unmistakable, was a strip of ribbon. Blue, it had been once. Somebody had braided a blue ribbon into that donkey's mane, careful, the way a person does a thing they love. And under the dust on her left hip when I'd cleaned her, there was a brand not a rancher's iron but a small neat thing, 2 letters joined, a D and an H run together. DH. I sat back on my heels and looked at that and I thought, somebody loved these animals and somebody lost them, and it liked to have killed them when they did. You don't braid a ribbon into a donkey's mane that you mean to leave dying in a ditch. I asked in town the next week when I rode in for salt. I'm not a man who asks people things generally, and I could see it surprised the storekeep, old Wendell, to have a sack cob leaning on his counter making conversation. I asked him did he know whose donkeys carried a joined DH, and Wendell scratched his chin and said it'd be the Doan place, most likely Doan, Hetty Doan, the widow that had the homestead out past the wash, except she was gone now, gone these 2 months. Drought took the place. Bank took what the drought left. She'd loaded a wagon and started for her sister's down on the river, Wendell had heard, and that was the last anybody'd seen of her. She had donkeys, I said. She had everything but luck, Wendell said, doted on them animals. Folks laughed at her for it, keeping donkeys like they was children when she could barely keep herself, but she was a proud one, wouldn't take a thing from a soul, offered her credit once and she near took my head off. He shook his head. Hard country for a proud woman alone. I rode home thinking about a proud woman who braided ribbons into her donkey's manes and wouldn't take credit, and had loaded a wagon, and started for the river and somewhere on that road had lost the only thing she loved. Because that's what had happened. I worked it out, piecing it together the way you do. Her wagon had broken down or her team had played out somewhere on the Quillback Road and she'd had to choose. She couldn't carry the donkeys, and she couldn't stay and die with them, and she couldn't make them walk fast enough on a dying road. And so somewhere in there, a proud, grieving woman had had to leave 4 animals she loved in the dust and walk on to live, because there was no other thing to do, and she'd have carried that the rest of her days. The oldest one, the one already dead when I found them, that one she'd likely not have known was failing till too late. And the rest she'd left, and they'd lain down by the wash to die where everybody rode past. It put a weight on me I hadn't reckoned for. It's one thing to save a stray. It's another to find out the stray was somebody's heart, and that somebody was out there alive, thinking she'd left them to die, carrying it. I didn't know where she was. The river was a wide word. Her sister could have been any place along 80 miles of it. I told myself there was nothing to be done, that I'd keep the animals well, and that was the whole of what I owed. But I'd taken to braiding that blue ribbon back into the gray Jenny's mane every time it worked loose, careful, the way the woman had, and I think somewhere in me I'd already decided I was keeping them for somebody, not just keeping them. That's about when Royce Embry came to my place. He came on a Sunday, in a buggy, in his church clothes, which should have warned me. Embry never did a hard thing in work clothes if he could do it in his Sunday best. He liked to make a man feel the wrongness was all on the man's side. I was out at the foaling shed when he drove up, and Sparrow, the little Jenny foal, was butting at my pockets for the bit of dried apple I'd taken to carrying, and Brick was dozing in the shade, and the gray Jenny stood with her head over the rail watching the lane like she always did, like she was still waiting on somebody to come up it. Embry climbed down out of his buggy and stood looking at the 3 of them with a slow smile spreading on his red face, and I knew before he opened his mouth that he'd come for them, and that he'd already worked out how he meant to be in the right. "Well now," he said, "word's all over town, Cobb, old Asa Cobb playing wet nurse to a passel of donkeys." He hooked his thumbs in his vest. Didn't hardly believe it, had to come see. "You've seen," I said. "I have." He walked up to the rail, and the gray Jenny put her ears back and stepped away from him, which told me something about Embry, because that animal trusted near everybody by then. "Doan stock, ain't they? That joined DH I'd know at any place." He smiled wider. "I held the paper on the Doan place, Cobb, note and chattel both. House, land, tools, and stock. All of it come to me when she defaulted, including these." I didn't say anything. I'd half expected it, but it still landed cold. "Now I'd written 'em off," Embry went on, comfortable, enjoying himself. "Figured the drought ate 'em like it ate everything else of hers. But here they are, fat and sleek on your feed and your water, which I appreciate, Cobb, I surely do. You've improved my property considerable." He let that sit. "I'll send a man around Tuesday to collect 'em." And there it was. He'd take them, not because he wanted donkeys. Embry had no more use for a donkey than for a hymn book, but because they were leverage, because everything was leverage to him, because 3 donkeys an old fool had near killed himself saving were worth more to him as a thing he could take than as a thing he could use. He'd sell them off separate to whoever, or he'd hold them over me, and either way the gray Jenny would go back into the hands that had ridden around her in the first place. I thought about a great many things to say. I am old enough to have learned that most of them only make a man like Embry happier. "They're not for sale," I said. "And they're not for collecting. That woman didn't default on these. She lost them on the road trying to save them, and they near died of it, and I spent the last water in my canteen on them 11 miles from home. Whatever paper you've got, you didn't carry a one of them out of that ditch." I did. Embry's smile didn't move, but his eyes did. "The law don't much care who carried what out of a ditch, Cobb. The law cares whose name's on the note." "Then I expect we'll find out what the law cares about," I said. "Tuesday or any other day, your man comes onto my place after these animals. He'll go back to you the way he came and lighter in the saddle. You can write that on your paper." Now I'm an old man, and Embry knew it, and we both knew there was a kind of bluff in it. But there's a thing about a man who's buried his wife and quit being afraid of much. I meant it, and Embry could see I meant it, and a bully who deals in paper does not actually like to find out what a man with nothing left to lose will do. He climbed back in his buggy slower than he'd climbed down. "I'll be back with the sheriff and the paper," he said, "and you'll hand 'em over and you'll look the fool you are. You always were a stiff-necked old." He thought better of the rest of it and clucked to his horse and pulled around in my yard and drove off down the lane, and the gray Jenny watched him go with her ears flat back the whole way. I stood there a while after the dust settled. I'd made a stand, and I'd half meant it, and the cold truth under it was that Embry was probably right about the paper. If there was a note and a chattel clause and the widow had defaulted, then in the eyes of the county those 3 donkeys were Royce Embry's, and an old man's fondness and an old man's spent canteen didn't enter into it. I had bought myself some days, maybe, and a fight I'd likely lose. I went to the house and I got down the old tin where I kept what I had, and what I had wasn't much. 2 dry years had seen to that, and I counted it, and I sat there a long while in the kitchen with the money in front of me, working out whether a man could buy 3 donkeys' freedom off Royce Embry, and how much of the ranch it'd cost me, and whether I cared. I'd about decided I didn't care, that I'd spend the place down to the dirt before I'd hand that gray Jenny back to the man who'd grinned at her dying, when I heard a wagon come up the lane. I figured it was Embry come back with the sheriff already, faster than I'd thought. I put the tin away and I took down the old rifle from over the door, not to use it, just so it'd be in my hands when I went out, and I went out onto the porch. It wasn't Embry. It was a flatbed wagon, borrowed looking, drawn by a single tired horse, and on the box was a woman. She was thin, too thin, the kind of thin that 2 hard years put on a person, and she wore a faded gray dress gone almost white at the seams and a man's old hat against the sun, and she sat that wagon straight-backed as a fence post for all that she looked wrung out to the bone. She drew up in my yard and she looked at me on the porch with the rifle in my hands, and she didn't flinch from it, and she didn't say good day, and she didn't ask was I a sack cob. She looked past me, toward the foaling shed, where the gray Jenny had got her head up over the rail at the sound of the wagon and gone very still. And then the gray Jenny made a sound I'd never heard her make, a sound I didn't know a donkey could make, low and broken and glad all at once, and she set up a clamor against that rail fit to tear it down, and Brick and Sparrow set to braying with her, and the woman on the wagon made a sound of her own, a small one, like something coming loose in her chest, and she got down off that box so fast she half fell, and she didn't look at me again at all. She went past me and the rifle, and the porch like none of it was there. She went across that yard to the foaling shed with her hand pressed to her mouth, and the gray Jenny stretched her gray neck out over the rail as far as it would go, and the woman reached her and put both arms around that donkey's head and her face down into the gray mane, where the faded blue ribbon was braided, the ribbon I'd kept braiding back in, and she stood there in the dust holding her donkey's head and shaking, and she didn't make hardly any sound at all. Which is how you know it's the deep kind of crying, and not the easy kind. I set the rifle down inside the door. It seemed a foolish thing to be holding. I gave her a long while. I went and drew a dipper of water from the cistern, and I waited on the porch, and the sun went down away, and she stood out there at the rail with her 3 donkeys all pressed up against her and her face in the gray Jenny's mane, and not one of us said a word, the whole outfit of us just standing in the evening like we'd all been waiting a long time for the same thing without knowing it. When she finally lifted her head and turned around, her face was wet and streaked and she'd quit trying to hide it, and she looked at me across the yard, and she said the first thing she'd said since she drove up. "I left them," she said. Her voice was rough. "I want you to know that before you say anything kind to me. I left them. The wagon broke down on the Quillbeck Road and the team couldn't pull double and I couldn't make them walk and I couldn't carry them and I had a choice between dying with them and walking on, and I walked on." She said it like a confession, like she'd been saying it to herself every night for 2 months and had finally found a person to say it out loud to. Every soul I told said it was sense, said don't carry it, and I've carried it every step since that I left my animals to die in a ditch to save my own self. So don't," her voice cracked and she set her jaw against it. "Don't tell me I'm fortunate or it worked out or the Lord's hand was in it. I left them. That's mine to carry whatever else is true." I have thought a great many times about what I said back to her, because I believe it was the most important thing I ever said to anybody, and I very near didn't say it right. "Ma'am," I said, "I rode that same road 2 months later, and I had a full canteen and a fresh horse and 11 miles between me and home, and I sat there on that road a full minute deciding to ride past your animals same as everybody else did. The only reason I didn't is 2 wagons went by while I sat there, and I got contrary about it. I came down off the porch a step or two. Leaving them to save yourself wasn't the wrong of that road. The wrong of that road was everybody who passed with water to spare and didn't stop, and ma'am, you weren't one of those. You're the one who carried the grief of it. The grief's the proof you didn't do wrong. You did the only thing there was, and it about killed you, and then you came looking when you heard. Don't you stand in my yard and call yourself the villain of it. I won't have it." She looked at me a long moment, and something went out of her shoulders, some long-held thing, not all of it, but some. "Hetty Doan," she said. "Asak Cobb," I said. "I know who you are," she said. "Whole town's talking about the crazy old man saved a family of donkeys nobody else would touch." A little of something that wasn't quite a smile moved at the corner of her mouth, the first I'd seen on her. "I walked the last 6 miles. The horse is borrowed and he's spent. I heard it in town this morning, the joined letters, and I didn't even go to my sister's. I turned the wagon around and came." She looked back at the donkeys, at the gray Jenny who would not take her head from under Hetty's hand. "I came to thank you and to see them once. I'll not impose past that. I know what folks say about me taking charity." And there it was, the proud thing Wendell had warned me of, the thing that had near taken his head off over a line of credit. She'd come on a borrowed horse with nothing, to thank an old man and look at her donkeys one time and then go on to her sisters and disappear into being a poor relation, because she'd sooner do that than be beholden. I want to tell you I said something wise. What I actually said was the truth, which is sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. "There's a man named Royce Embry coming back here Tuesday with a sheriff and a paper to take these animals off my place," I said. "Claims your note had a chattel clause and they're his now. I told him he'd take them over my objection and I meant it, but he's likely got the law on his side and I'm one old man." I looked at her. "I don't know the first thing about the paper you signed or what's in it, but you do. And I could use somebody who does, between now and Tuesday. A great deal more than these donkeys could use to be handed back to the man who watched them dying and grinned about it. That's not charity, Mrs. Doan. That's me asking your help with a fight that's half yours to start with. There's a difference, and I expect you know it better than anybody." Hetty Doan went very still, and then she looked at me, really looked, the way the gray Jenny had looked at me out of the bottom of that ditch, making certain of me, deciding whether to spend the last of herself believing it. "Royce Embry," she said slowly, "does not hold a clean note on my place, and there is not one word in anything I signed about that stock." Her chin came up, and for the first time since she'd driven into my yard, she didn't look wrung out at all. She looked like a woman remembering she had teeth. "And if he's fool enough to bring a paper into a courtroom, Mr. Cobb, then I would dearly love to be standing there when he does." The borrowed horse couldn't go another mile, so Hetty Doan stayed that night. I want to set that down plainly, because in a small county a thing like that gets talked about, and I'll not have the talk be wrong. I gave her the house. I made up Adeline's old room, that I hadn't opened in 9 years, and I aired the bedding on the line and beat the dust out of the quilt my wife had pieced, and I felt strange the whole time doing it, like a man walking through a part of his own house he'd boarded up. And I took my bedroll out to the foaling shed and slept among the donkeys, which suited me and suited them, the gray Jenny lying down close enough that her warm back was against my shoulder all night. There was nothing in it but a tired woman, an old man, and a borrowed horse that needed resting, and any soul who wants to make it more than that can come say so to my face. In the morning she was up before me, which I'd not have thought possible, and she had the stove going and coffee made out of my poor stores, and she'd already been out and looked the donkeys over by daylight, run her hands down every leg, lifted every foot, parted the gray Jenny's mane to find the place the ribbon braided in. "You doctored Brick's gut," she said when I came in, not a question. "He foundered and you walked it out of him. There's the marks of it, the way the hoofs ringed." She set a cup in front of me. "And you've been feeding the little one apple out of your pocket till she's spoiled rotten and won't leave a man alone." A pause. "Thank you. I've said it once and it wasn't enough, and I don't expect it'll ever be, so I'll likely keep saying it at odd moments and you'll have to bear it." "I'll bear it," I said. We sat at the table, the two of us, in the gray light, and she told me the whole of the paper. It went like this. Her husband, Owen Doane, had died 3 years back. A horse rolled on him. She said it flat, the way you say a thing you've worn smooth, and he'd left her the homestead clear, no debt on it. 160 acres proved up honest, and the deed in a tin box. The first drought year she'd held on fine. The second one broke her, the way it broke everybody, and she'd gone to Royce Embry, because Embry was the only money in the country, for a loan against the next crop to carry her stock through to spring. "He drew the note himself," she said. "I can read, Mr. Cobb. My father was a school teacher, and I read better than most men in this county, and I read every word of that note before I signed it, and it was a clean loan. $200 against the place, to be paid at harvest, 10%. That's what I signed. There was not one word in it about my stock, and there was not one word in it about forfeit of the deed. I'd not have signed that, and I told him so, and he said, 'Of course not, Mrs. Doane. This is just a neighbor helping a neighbor through a hard year.'" Her jaw set. "And there was no harvest, because there was no rain, and when I couldn't pay he came out with a different paper entirely and told me I'd defaulted and the place and everything on it was his, and he had a paper that said so, and it had my signature on the bottom of it." "Forged?" I said. "Either forged or—" She stopped. He drew the note in his own hand. "He had me sign 2 copies, he said, one for each of us. That was nothing unusual. I'd warrant the copy he kept and the copy he showed me when he came to take the place were not the same paper. I'd warrant he wrote a clean note on the top sheet I read and a foul one on the sheet underneath, and I signed the foul one without knowing, or he changed it after. I don't know how he did it. I only know what I signed and what he claims, and they are not the same document, and I have not got my copy because he took it, said he'd hold both for safekeeping." She laughed, a short hard sound with no fun in it. "Safekeeping. And you didn't fight it?" "With what?" she said. "I'd no money for a lawyer and no copy of my own note to set against his, and no friend in the county with money or standing, and Royce Embry holds paper on half of Sundermere, which means half of Sundermere is careful not to cross him. I had a wagon and a team and 4 donkeys and the clothes I stood in. I loaded the wagon. The wagon broke on the Quillback Road." She looked at her hands. "You know the rest of that part better than I do, I expect." I sat with that a while. Outside the window the sun was coming up hard and clear, another rainless day, and I could hear Sparrow kicking up her heels in the shed, full of meal and devilment, a thing that 2 months ago was dying in a ditch. "Mrs. Doane," I said, "where's the deed?" She looked up. "You said your husband left the place clear and the deed in a tin box. Embry's got a foul note he claims forfeits the place. But a note's a note and a deed's a deed, and if the deed's in your name and there's no honest forfeit, then the worst that foul paper can do is make you owe him $200. It can't make him the owner of your land or your stock unless a court says the forfeit clause is good. Have you got the deed?" She was very still. "I have got the deed," she said slowly. "It's at my sister's in the bottom of my trunk. I'd not have left that anywhere a man like Embry could reach it. It's the one thing I made sure of." Her eyes came up to mine, and there was something kindling in them now. "You're saying his paper, even if a judge believed it, only makes me a debtor. It doesn't make him an owner, not while I hold a clean deed he can't touch." "I'm an old cattleman, not a lawyer," I said. but I've signed enough notes and buried enough debts to know the difference between owing a man money and a man owning your ground. Embry's been letting you believe they're the same thing because it suited him. They're not. I turned my cup in my hands. Tuesday he's coming here with a sheriff and a paper to take 3 donkeys off my place under a chattel clause. If that chattel clause is in the same foul note you never agreed to, and if you've got a deed that shows the place and everything on it was yours free and clear, then the question in front of that sheriff isn't whether Embry can take the donkeys. It's whether Embry forged a note. And that's a question that can put a man in front of a different kind of court entirely. Hetty Doan stood up from the table. She walked to the window and stood looking out at the hard, bright morning, and her back was straight as a fence post again. And when she spoke her voice was low and even, and there was iron all through it. "My sister is 40 miles down the river," she said. "If I leave on a fresh horse at first light tomorrow, I can be there by dark and back here by Tuesday noon with the deed in my hand." She turned around. "Will you lend me a horse, Mr. Cobb? Not give, lend. I'll bring it back, and I'll bring the deed. And on Tuesday I would like very much to be standing in your yard when Royce Embry produces his paper in front of a man of the law, because I have been waiting 2 years to put my deed down on a table next to that man's lie." "You can have the best horse I own," I said, "and I'll come the 40 miles with you so you don't ride it alone." "No," she said, and it wasn't proud this time, it was something else, something steadier. "You'll stay here and keep Embry off these animals if he comes early, which is exactly the sort of thing he'd do. You'll mind my donkeys, Mr. Cobb. I'll fetch my deed. We've each got the part that's ours to do, a breath. That's not charity either, in case you were going to argue it. That's 2 people splitting a fight down the middle. You taught me the difference yesterday. I'm only saying it back to you." I didn't argue it. There wasn't a thing in it to argue. She left before dawn the next morning on my bay gelding, the best horse on the place, with a sack of meal and a canteen I'd filled to the brim. I made a point of filling it to the brim, and I stood in the lane and watched her ride out the way the gray Jenny stood at the rail and watched the lane. And when she'd gone over the rise, I went and let the donkeys out into the yard, and they crowded around me looking for the woman, and I had to tell them like a fool again, "She's coming back. She's just gone to fetch a paper. She's coming back." I'll not pretend the next 2 days were easy. Embry didn't wait for Tuesday. Of course he didn't. Monday afternoon a buggy and 2 riders came up my lane, and it was Embry and the sheriff, a tired, heavy man named Cull Renfrew, who I'd known 30 years and never thought much of either way, and Embry's hired man, a hard young fellow named Petty, who wore his gun low and liked you to see it. I came out on the porch. I did not bring the rifle this time. I'd thought about that the long 2 days, and I'd decided that an old man with a rifle was exactly the thing Embry wanted me to be, a wild old fool, easy to write up as dangerous, easy to take advantage of in front of the law. So I came out with my hands empty and my hat on, and I leaned on the porch post like we were all there to talk weather. "Cobb," the sheriff said, heavy, "Royce here's got a paper says these donkeys are his, chattel off the Doan default. I've looked it over, and it's got a clause, and it's got the woman's signature. I don't much like being out here, but the paper's a paper. I'm going to have to let him take the stock." "Let me see the paper, Cull," I said. Embry handed it down out of the buggy with a grin, sure of himself, and the sheriff passed it up to me on the porch, and I read it. I read it slow, the way Hetty said she'd read the first one, every word. And it was just as she'd said. A note for $200, and then a clause that said upon default the whole of the property, both real and chattel, the land and all stock and tools and goods thereon, forfeited to the lender. And at the bottom, Hetty Doan in a hand. "This her signature?" I said. "It's her name," Embry said. "She signed it. I watched her sign it." "That's not what I asked," I said. "I asked, is it her signature?" I held the paper up to the light. "Because I've got a thing here, Cull, that I'd like you to look at as a lawman and not as a man who owes Royce Embry money." I came down off the porch slow and held the paper out so the sheriff could see where I was pointing. "This here note's written in one hand the whole way down, the body of it and the clause both, All the same ink, same pen, same slant. That's Embry's hand. He says himself he drew it. And then there's the signature, Hetty Doan, in a different ink, lighter, and a different slant. Now that's natural enough, a body signs in their own hand. But look here. I put my finger on the clause. The body of the note's a little crowded at the bottom, ain't it? The lines run closer together down here near the clause than they do up top. Like a man wrote the top of a note with room to spare, got a signature on the bottom, and then went back and filled in the space between with a clause in a smaller, tighter hand to make it fit. The sheriff took the paper back and held it up himself, and I watched him see it, because it was there. I'd stared at it for the 2 minutes Embry let me hold it, and it was there, the top 3 lines easy and open, and then the lines bunching, crowding, the letters getting smaller as they came down toward a signature that had clearly been on the page already, the forfeit clause squeezed into a space that had been left for something shorter. "That don't prove a thing," Embry said, and his voice had gone up a notch. "Man writes tight, man writes loose, that's nothing. Cull, you've got a valid paper and a valid signature, and the law's the law. Take the stock." "It proves enough," I said, "to ask one question. Royce, you said you had her sign 2 copies, one for each of you for safe keeping. So there's another copy of this note someplace. Where's hers?" Embry's face went a color I'd not seen on it before. "And here's the other thing, Cull," I said, before Embry could find his feet. "Mrs. Hetty Doan is going to be standing in this yard tomorrow at noon Tuesday, which is the day Embry himself named to come collect, with the original deed to her homestead in her own hand, a deed her late husband left her clear and clean. No lien, no note, no forfeit, recorded down at the county seat where you can wire and check it this very afternoon. Now I'm an old cattleman and no lawyer. But I know that a deed beats a note, and I know that a note can make a woman owe a man money, but it cannot make that man the owner of her land and her stock unless a clause in that note is good. And we've just stood here in my yard and watched you and me both see that clause was squeezed onto that page after the fact." I looked at him. "So you can take these donkeys today, Royce, over my objection, the way you came to. And tomorrow that woman will be in front of this same sheriff with a clean recorded deed and a forged note, and the question won't be whose donkeys these are. It'll be whether Royce Embry committed forgery to steal a widow's homestead, and how many other notes in that strongbox of yours have got clauses squeezed in at the bottom in a tighter hand." It was quiet in the yard. Sparrow chose that moment to come trotting up to the rail and bray at the strangers, full of meal and impudence, a fat, sleek little Jenny that 2 months ago was dying, and the sound of it hung there in the hot, still air. The sheriff, Cull Renfrew, folded the note up slow, and he didn't hand it back to Embry. He put it in his own breast pocket. "I believe," he said, "I'll just hold on to this, Royce, till tomorrow, till the lady's here with her deed. And I believe I'll send a wire to the county seat this afternoon and ask after that recording, like Cobb says." He looked at Embry, and there was a thing in his tired face that I'd never seen there in 30 years, which was a man deciding he'd rather not be owned anymore. "And Royce, I'd take it kindly if that strongbox of yours stayed right where it is, and didn't have any notes go missing out of it between now and tomorrow. Be a shame if it did." Embry sat in his buggy with his red face and his squeezed-in claws in the sheriff's pocket, and for a moment I thought he'd do something foolish. And the hired man Petty shifted his weight and put his hand near his gun, and I stood very still and empty-handed and old in the middle of my yard, and waited to see what kind of day it was going to be. It was the kind of day where a bully looks at the arithmetic and finds it's gone against him. Embry yanked his team around without a word and drove off down my lane in a fury of dust, and Petty rode after him, and the sheriff sat his horse a moment looking at the donkeys. "Stiff-necked old fool," he said to me, but there wasn't any heat in it. "You know he'll fight it." "Let him fight it with a deed on the table," I said. "I'll back the lady's deed against his squeezed-in note any day of the week, and so will you, Cull, now you've seen it." "Now I've seen it," the sheriff agreed, heavy and slow, and he turned his horse and rode out after the other two, and I was left standing in my yard with 3 donkeys and the long wait till noon. She came at noon, just as she'd said. Came up the rise on my bay gelding with the deed in a flat tin against her chest, 40 miles down and 40 miles back in 2 days, gray-faced with tiredness and sitting that saddle straight as ever, and the donkeys set up their clamor at the rail the moment they saw her, and she came into the yard, and I told her it was done, that the sheriff had the note and had wired the county and Embry had run off red as a brick. And Hetty Doan sat there on my horse and listened to the whole of it, and then she got down. And she did not cry this time. She laughed. It started small and it built, and it wasn't a hard laugh like the one at my table. It was the real thing, a laugh with 2 years of carried weight coming off it, and she leaned against the bay's warm shoulder and laughed till she had to wipe her eyes, and the donkeys brayed along like they were in on it, and I stood there grinning like the old fool I am, and I'll tell you that was as fine a sound as I'd heard in 9 years, a proud woman laughing in my yard with her deed against her chest. It took some weeks to be truly done. There were trips to the county seat, and the deed laid down next to the note, and a clerk who held the 2 papers up to a window same as I had and saw the same crowded clause, and other folks. Embry held paper on half of Sundermere, like I said, and once it got out that Cull Renfrew was looking hard at squeezed-in clauses, it turned out Hetty Doan was not the only soul in the county who'd signed a clean note and been shown a foul one. There was the Price family and the Lindells, and old Wendell the storekeeper himself, and a half-dozen more. And they came forward slow at first, and then all in a rush the way folks do once one brave soul has gone first. And Hetty Doan was the brave soul who'd gone first. She stood up in front of the county, a widow with nothing but a borrowed horse and a tin deed, and said this man forged my note and made it stick, and it broke Royce Embry, not just his hold on her place but his hold on the whole country, because once one note was proved foul, every man he'd ever squeezed came looking at his own paper, and there's no recovering from that. He left the county before the snow. I don't know where he went, and I never troubled to find out. The town that had ridden past her donkeys in the ditch, that had grinned and quoted scripture and driven wide around a dying thing, that town came around. They mostly do once it's easy. The Reverend Price came out to my place in the fall, hat in his hands, and stood at the foaling shed rail and looked at the gray Jenny a long time and said, "I rode past these animals on the Quilbeck Road, Asa. I've thought on it since. The Lord's mercy was in my mouth and not in my hands that day, and I'm ashamed. And I'll give him this, it cost him something to come say it, and he said it, which is more than most men do. I told him the road was full of men who rode past and only one woman who'd carried the grief of being made to leave, and that if he wanted to make it right he could help the Doan place get back on its feet, and he did, and so did half the town, once they remembered they had hands. But I've run ahead of the part that matters most, and I not want you to think this story was only about a forged note and a town's bad conscience. Those were the bones of it. The heart of it was slower and quieter, and it happened across that whole long autumn while the legal part ground along, in the small daily business of 2 people and 3 donkeys sharing a place. Because Hetty Doan didn't leave. She'd got her deed proved and her homestead back, free and clear, 160 acres past the wash with her name on it and no man's lie against it. She could have gone back to it any day. And there was a stretch of weeks where I figured she would, where I braced for it, where I caught myself memorizing the look of her at my stove of a morning the way you memorize a thing you know you're about to lose. I'd grown used to her. I'll say it plain, old as I am. I'd grown used to the coffee made before I woke, and the donkeys doctored proper, and a voice in the house that wasn't mine, and I knew it for the dangerous thing it was, an old widower letting himself get used to a thing that was going to walk back out to its own land come spring. It was the gray Jenny in the end, who said the thing none of us would. It was an evening in October. The light was going long and gold across the Caldwell Flats, and they'd greened up some that fall. We'd finally had rain in September, the drought breaking the same season as everything else, and Hetty and I were at the foaling shed rail watching the donkeys in the new grass. Brick had grown into a stout, strong young jack, and Sparrow was still small and still impudent and still robbed my pockets daily. And the gray Jenny stood between us with her head over the rail, and Hetty was scratching her along the jaw the way she liked, the blue ribbon braided fresh in her mane. "I've been thinking I ought to take them home," Hetty said. "To my place. It's mine again. There's no reason to keep imposing on you, and these are my animals and—" The gray Jenny, at that exact moment, turned her head and put it square against my chest and leaned, heavy, the way she'd taken to doing, all her weight against me. And then she reached out and caught the sleeve of Hetty's dress in her gray lips and tugged, and stood there, her head on my chest and her teeth in Hetty's sleeve, holding the two of us, plain as anything in the gold evening light. Hetty looked at that, and I looked at it, and neither of us said anything for a good while. "I'm 66 years old," I said finally. "I don't know why that was the first thing. I buried my wife 9 years ago, and I'd made my peace with finishing this out alone, and I'd told that to an empty kitchen so many times I'd come to believe it. I'm not a soft man, and I'm not an easy one, and I've nothing to offer that a younger or finer man couldn't offer better." I put my hand up slow and laid it on the gray Jenny's neck, next to Hetty's hand, not touching it, just near. "But I rode past your animals on the Quillbeck Road for 1 whole minute, Hetty, and the only reason I stopped was I got contrary about a thing I couldn't have named. And I've come to think the thing I couldn't name was this, that I was done passing by, that I'd done enough passing by for one life, and I'd be damned if I'd ride around one more living thing that needed somebody to stop." My voice wasn't as steady as I'd have liked. "You don't have to take your donkeys home. There's grass enough here and a deed of your own in your tin if you ever want to leave, free and clear, nobody holding a thing over you. But I'd be more than glad if you'd stay. Not as charity, never that, as two people who quit passing by." Hetty Doan didn't answer right away. She was a woman who read every word before she signed, and I'd not have wanted her any other way. She took her hand off the gray Jenny's jaw, and she moved it the few inches over and put it on top of mine, on the donkey's warm neck, in the gold light, and the gray Jenny stood between us, holding us both, and leaning her old gray weight against my chest like she'd known the shape of this since the bottom of that ditch. "I read the note before I signed it," Hetty said quietly. "I always do. I read this one too, a sacob, every word of you all this long autumn. There's no foul clause squeezed in the bottom of you anywhere." I looked. "A breath. I'll stay, not as charity, as two people splitting a life down the middle, each with the part that's ours to do. I'll keep my deed in my tin, and you'll keep braiding that ribbon when it works loose, and we'll see what grows on ground that's had some rain on it at last." "There's a juniper up on the rise," I said, "with a grave under it. I'd want you to know about her. Adeline, she'd have liked you. She'd have laughed at me for the donkeys and then loved them harder than I do." "Then we'll keep the juniper watered," Hetty said simply, "and we'll tell the donkeys about her, since they're the ones you told all your secrets to in that ditch. Don't think I didn't guess that. A man doesn't get a donkey looking at him the way that gray looks at you without he's said some things." And she smiled at me. The real thing, the whole of it. A proud woman in the gold light with her hand on mine and her deed in her tin and her donkeys in the new grass. And I felt 9 years of cold kitchen go off me like a coat I'd worn too long. We married in the spring, when the wash ran water again for the first time in 3 years. It was no grand thing. The Reverend Price did it, out at the foaling shed rail, which Hetty insisted on, because she said the gray Jenny had done the proposing and ought to stand up with us. And so she did, with her blue ribbon fresh braided and Brick and Sparrow crowding in to rob the wedding guests' pockets. Half of Sundermere came, the half that had got its honest notes back once Embry was broken, which was most of it. And they came partly out of gladness and partly, I think, out of the shamed memory of a road they'd all ridden past, and that was all right. A town can be the better for remembering a thing it's ashamed of, if it lets the remembering change its hands and not just its mouth. Hetty kept her name on her deed. That 160 acres past the wash stayed hers, in her tin, free and clear, and we ran my cattle and her donkeys across both places together and called it one outfit. But the deed stayed in her name, and I'd have had it no other way. A woman who's had a man try to squeeze a forfeit clause onto the bottom of her life ought to keep her own ground in her own hand, and any man who'd ask different than that never deserved her to start with. The donkeys did well. I'll tell you a thing that the practical-minded would call foolish, and that I call the plain working of how kindness comes back around. Hetty knew donkeys the way I knew cattle better, and that gray Jenny threw 2 more foals over the next years, and Brick grew into the finest jack in the county, and folks came from 40 miles to breed to him, because a good donkey on a hard country ranch is worth his weight in any cattle you care to name, and Hetty bred them careful and dignified, and they put more honest money on our table across the years than the cattle ever did. The animals everybody rode past dying in a ditch rebuilt the whole place. I've thought on that more times than I can count. The thing the world threw away was the thing that saved us, saved her, saved me, saved the ground both our names sit on. But I'll not pretend it was the money that mattered, or the breeding, or the ranch saved. Those are the kind of endings men put on stories to make the kindness look like good business, and the kindness wasn't good business. The kindness was a fool's errand. The kindness was an old man emptying his last canteen on a dry road 11 miles from home for 3 animals that should have died, and it made no sense, and I'd do it again tomorrow and every day after. Hetty's been gone 2 winters now. I should tell you that since I've told you the rest. She went easy and old and full of years in our own bed with my hand in hers, and the last thing she said to me she said with a smile, and it was, "Keep the ribbon braided, Asa." And I do. The gray Jenny went a few years before her, the way they do, and she's buried up on the rise alongside the juniper, alongside Adeline, alongside, well. There's a row of graves up there now of the ones I've loved, and the gray Jenny's in it, and I don't care who finds that strange. She earned her place there better than most Christians earn theirs. I'm an old, old man now, older than I ever thought to be. I keep the place with hired help, and Brick's grandfulls graze the flats, and every one of them carries a little of that gray Jenny in them. And on the youngest Jenny foal of the newest crop I braid a strip of blue ribbon into the mane, careful, the way a woman taught me, the way she did it before me, a thing that gets handed down on this ground now along with the deed and the brand. And when I ride out slow these days, but I still ride, I take the Quilbeck Road sometimes, past the dry wash where I found them, and I never once pass it without stopping. I get down, old as I am, and I stand a minute in the white dust by the ditch where everybody rode around 3 dying things, and I think about the minute I sat my horse there fixing to ride past, and the 2 wagons that went by, and the contrary thing in me that climbed down anyhow. A man rides past a great many things in a long life. I rode past more than I'd like to count in my hard years, when I was busy needing nobody. But I stopped one time on one road, when it cost me my last water and made no sense at all, and that one time gave me back everything I'd buried and a whole life besides, a wife and a home and a row of graves I'm proud to lie down in when my turn comes. So if you're ever on a dry road, and there's a dying thing in the ditch, and every soul ahead of you has ridden around it, and the smart and the sensible voice in you says ride on, I'd ask you to remember an old cowboy who very near did and didn't, and got the whole of his life out of the not riding past. Stop, it won't make sense, stop anyway. That's the only wisdom I've got, after all these years, and a gray donkey in a ditch is the one who taught it to me.